Retro Road Test, 1991 Fiat Tipo 1.4 vs 1991 Ford Escort 1.4L. If ever there was a clash of early 1990s family car titans, it is surely the face-off between the plucky Italian upstart, the Fiat Tipo, and Britain's dependable favourite, the Ford Escort. Both appeared in 1.4-litre form in 1991 with the express purpose of appealing to families, fleet buyers, cautious first-timers and anyone else who needed something with four wheels that wouldn't embarrass them in the office car park. These were the days before digital dashboards were fashionable, or functional, before touchscreens were seen outside of Star Trek, and when cuff holders were still considered a decadent American luxury. Simpler times, perhaps. Certainly boxier times. Still, simplicity does not mean lack of interest. Both cars represent very different approaches to the same problem: how to produce a small family hatchback that does a bit of everything while keeping the price sensible and the motoring public vaguely cheerful. So let us roll up our sleeves, pop the bonnet catch, and take a look at what these two early 90s stalwarts were all about. Styling and design. Fiat Tipo 1.4. If there was one thing Fiat was good at around this time, it was hiring clever stylists. The Tipo was penned with a squared-off, clean-lined aesthetic that looked rather modern in its day. It wasn't beautiful in the classical Italian sense, there were no swooping lines or flirtatious curves, but it had that neat, architectural vibe that told the world the designer owned at least one pair of avant-garde glasses. The Tipo also scored points for being the first car in its class to use fully galvanized body panels, an admission, perhaps, that Fiat shells of the 1970s tended to dissolve faster than an aspirin in a puddle. The galvanizing helped its longevity and kept the crisp form of the shell looking respectable for longer than many expected. From the front, the Tipo greeted you with wide, rectangular headlights and a subtle, aerodynamic nose. Its profile was decidedly upright, almost like a small block of flats with wheels, but that was largely intentional. Interior space was the priority, and the Tipo offered bucket loads of it. The back end was plain but tidy, with a large tailgate and simple lamp clusters. Ford Escort 1.4L, 1991. The Ford Escort of 1991 had already entered its slightly apologetic phase of existence. Reviews at the time were less than kind, often using phrases such as competent but uninspiring and on one memorable occasion about as exciting as the color beige. That said, the Escort remained one of Britain's best-selling cars, proof that being dependable is far more valuable than being charismatic. Stylistically, the Escort was smoother than the Tipo but also far more conservative. It had that familiar Ford look, friendly, rounded lights, a modest grille, and a shape that would offend absolutely nobody except perhaps those who objected to blandness on principle. Designed to appeal to everyone, it inevitably looked like it had been designed by committee after a particularly heavy lunch. Still, the Escort was cleanly proportioned, easy on the eye, and unmistakably car-shaped, a timeless quality, if not a glamorous one. Interior and practicality. Fiat Tipo. Here is where the Tipo absolutely stomped into the lead. Fiat made a big thing of its interior packaging, and they were right to. The cabin of the Tipo was vast by early 90s family hatch standards. You could fit 4 adults in comfort, 5 with mild complaint, and still have space for all their shopping. The upright body and long wheelbase meant headroom and legroom were excellent front and rear. The dashboard was modern for its time, with clear, angular instruments and well-placed controls. Some models even featured an oddly futuristic digital dashboard, which was very exciting when it worked, and equally exciting, though for the wrong reasons, when it didn't. Thankfully the 1.4 models more commonly featured a conventional analog setup that was simple and reliable. Material quality was typical Fiat, hard plastics that somehow felt cheerful and slightly warm, like something you'd find in a primary school. Everything was screwed together reasonably well, though some panels had the subtle creakiness of kitchen Tupperware. Boot space was generous too, with a wide loading aperture and fold-flat seats that made the Tipo a surprisingly useful workhorse. Ford Escort. Inside, the Escort felt narrower, darker, and far less adventurous. It was as if Ford had taken one look at the bold approach of cars like the Tipo and responded with, better not risk it. Everything inside was predictable, a straightforward instrument cluster, a conventional center console, and seats that were somewhere between acceptable and indifferent. Interior room was fine for the time, but not outstanding. Taller rear passengers might find their knees gently grazing the back of the front seats, though the Escort remained a practical car for families with small children or adults with modest leg requirements. Seats were firm, durable and comfortable on long trips, one thing Ford traditionally excelled at. Visibility was decent all round, and the switchgear was designed so that even the sort of person who struggles with complicated microwaves could operate it without anxiety. Boot space was competitive but narrower than the Tipos, and the loading lip was a touch higher. Engines and performance. Both cars in this test are fitted with 1.4-liter petrol engines, a configuration chosen because in 1991, 1.4 liters was considered a respectable compromise between I want to arrive on time and I don't want to spend all my money at Shell. Fiat Tipo 1.4 technical bits. The Tipo's 1.4-liter engine was part of Fiat's well-established Lampredi-derived family. Producing around 72 bhp, it offered reasonable low-end torque and revved freely. It wasn't going to set your socks on fire, but nor did it feel gutless. 0-60 miles per hour took somewhere in the region of 13.5 to 14 seconds, depending on how enthusiastic you were with the throttle, the wind direction, and whether you'd recently had a heavy lunch. Top speed hovered around 103 miles per hour. In typical Fiat fashion, the engine note had a faintly musical buzz to it, like a tenor who'd accidentally swallowed a wasp. It sounded eager, willing and slightly excitable. The Tipo felt at its best when driven in a fluid, relaxed manner. Keep it in its torque band and it rewarded you with smooth progress. Ford Escort 1.4L technical bits. The Escort's 1.4 used Ford's familiar CVH engine, a unit known for being durable, simple and occasionally a bit coarse. Output sat at around 75 bhp, giving it a small but noticeable power edge over the Tipo. 0-60 miles per hour came up in 13 to 13.5 seconds, and top speed was around 103 miles per hour. On paper it was marginally quicker. In reality, the CVH engine tended to feel more strained when pushed hard, emitting a sort of grumbly protest that suggested it really would rather you drove a little more gently. Where the Escort excelled was mid-range pull and predictability. The power delivery was steady, and the engine's slightly agricultural character made it feel tough, if not refined. Ride and handling. Fiat Tipo. Here's where the Fiat really becomes interesting. The Tipo was developed with input from people who genuinely cared about ride quality and handling balance. As a result, it had a supple suspension setup that absorbed bumps with Italian nonchalance. Small potholes and rough surfaces were dispatched with confidence, and the car maintained excellent composure at motorway speeds. Steering was light but accurate, with a pleasing sense of connection to the road. The Tipo wasn't a hot hatch, but it felt nimble and genuinely enjoyable to drive through twisty B roads. Body roll was present but well managed, and grip levels were respectable for the era. In everyday use, the Tipo felt airy, settled and reassuring. Ford Escort. If the Tipo was enjoyable, the Escort was, well, present. Ford's engineers at the time were capable of brilliance, as seen in the Fiesta XR2i and Sierra Sapphire Cosworth, but the standard Escort famously missed the mark. Ride quality was perfectly adequate, but the handling lacked sparkle. The front end felt vague, the rear end occasionally underdamped, and the whole experience leaned more towards competent commuter than driver's companion. Steering feel was muted, and although the Escort gripped respectably in corners, it never inspired the confidence of the Tipo. You could hustle it, but it felt more like you were making the Escort work overtime, and it wasn't particularly thrilled about it. On the plus side, for steady motorway and town driving, the Escort delivered predictable, fuss-free behavior. It was not exciting, but it was trustworthy, like an accountant who always answers emails on time but has never once laughed spontaneously. Economy and running costs. Fiat Tipo. The Tipo 1.4 returned around 35–40 miles per gallon in mixed driving, perfectly respectable for the time. Servicing was straightforward and inexpensive, though Fiat's dealer network in the early 90s did not have the best reputation for consistency. Parts availability was good, Fiat knew its cars needed keeping on the road, and insurance was reasonable. Ford Escort. The Escort achieved similar fuel economy, typically 37–41 miles per gallon, sometimes a tad more on long runs. Running costs were famously cheap, parts were everywhere, servicing was as straightforward as making toast, and any mechanic in Britain could fix one with a basic toolkit and a cup of tea. Insurance was also attractively priced, especially for younger drivers. Reliability and build quality. Fiat Tipo. By 1991, Fiat had improved reliability considerably compared to its rust-prone past. Galvanized panels helped enormously. Mechanical durability was decent, especially for the simpler 1.4 engines. Electrical gremlins, however, were still possible, particularly around switches, connectors and the occasional moody dashboard bulb. Interior materials often squeaked or faded sooner than owners liked, but overall the Tipo was better built than the stereotypes suggested. Ford Escort. The Escort wasn't bulletproof, but it was hardy. CVH engines went on for ages if serviced, and the body resisted corrosion reasonably well. Interior trim could feel a little flimsy, but it rarely broke in meaningful ways. Reliability was one of the Escort's strongest selling points. If the Tipo was the plucky eccentric friend who occasionally forgot their keys, the Escort was the boring but dependable chum who always remembered your birthday. Driving experience on the road. Around town. The Tipo wins. Its light steering, airy cabin and excellent visibility made it a breeze in urban driving. The Escort was fine, but the heavier steering and tighter cabin made it feel slightly less nimble. Motorways. The Escort's slightly more planted ride made it feel stable at a cruise, but the Tipo's comfort and cabin space gave it the edge on long journeys. Noise levels were similar, with both engines becoming vocal if pushed. Country roads. Tipo again. It simply handled better, with more composure and feedback. The Escort could keep up, but it felt like it was concentrating very hard to do so. Value for money. Fiat Tipo. In 1991, the Tipo was keenly priced and well equipped for the money. Buyers got space, comfort and freshness. Ford Escort. The Escort wasn't cheap, but its resale value was excellent because nearly everyone wanted one. Fleet buyers loved them, families trusted them, and as a result they held their worth. Verdict: which should you choose? Choosing between the Fiat Tipo 1.4 and the Ford Escort 1.4L in 1991 was a bit like choosing between a lively Italian cafe and a dependable British pub. Both provided a decent meal, but they did so in very different styles. The Tipo shines with superb interior space, better handling and ride, more modern design, a sense of cheerfulness and character. The Escort excels with rock-solid reliability, low running costs, excellent dealer support, good resale value, predictability. If you were buying purely with your heart in 1991, the Tipo was the more rewarding and forward-thinking choice. It felt newer, drove better, and offered more space than its rivals. It had charm, character, and enough quirks to keep ownership interesting without being stressful. If you were buying with your wallet or your head, the Escort was the sensible option. It wasn't thrilling, but it was easy to live with, easy to maintain, and extremely dependable. It was the safe pair of hands you bought when life was already complicated enough. The enthusiast's choice, and this reviewer's pick: the Fiat Tipo 1.4. The sensible family choice, the Ford Escort 1.4L. Both cars did their jobs well in their own ways. One did it with flair, the other with commitment. Either could have been the right choice in 1991, depending on what you wanted from your motoring life.